I'm Yusra Ghazi, a Master of Theological Studies candidate at Harvard Divinity School and a junior fellow at the Center for the Study of World Religions. Welcome to our panel on religious literacy, how knowing your neighbor can save the world. A few years ago, the Pew Forum conducted a survey of 32 religious knowledge questions. Americans on average answered 16 correctly. Fewer than half of the respondents, for example, could identify the four Gospels as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Only 47% knew that the Dalai Lama was Buddhist, and 55% knew that the Golden Rule was not one of the 10 Commandments. More than half of the Protestants could not identify Martin Luther as the man whose teachings inspired the Protestant Reformation, and 45% of the Catholics did not know that the Catholic Church teaches transubstantiation. Most people know that public school teachers, most people who were surveyed knew that public school teachers could not lead a classroom prayer, but only 23% realized that public school teachers are allowed to teach the Bible as literature in the classroom. Each one of our panelists today will speak about their work to address this degree of religious illiteracy across the country. The title of this event is intentionally provocative. How can knowing about the religious or secular values of your neighbor save the world? Personally, I've been involved in interfaith work for my entire adult life, and I believe something important happens when religiously diverse people come to know one another by engaging in collaborative work on associations or on community boards. There is a growing set of social science data that shows the impact that diverse community partnerships can have on increasing social cohesion and promoting peace. I applied to the Divinity School to learn more about this phenomenon, and this is the theme of my junior fellowship with the CSWR this year, Models of Faith-Based Civic Engagement. Today we'll examine religious and interfaith literacy and how more of it can positively impact the world. We'll start with opening remarks from each of our panelists and then conversation for the second half of our time together. Let's meet our panelists. Ibu Patel is the founder and president of the Interfaith Youth Corps, a Chicago-based nonprofit that aims to make interfaith cooperation a social norm. He's the author of Acts of Faith and Sacred Ground, and was a member of President Obama's inaugural Faith Council. He's a regular contributor to the Washington Post, Huffington Post, CNN, and public radio, and speaks frequently about interfaith cooperation on college campuses. We're also joined by Professor Diana Eck, who is a professor of comparative religion and Indian studies at Harvard University, master of Lowell House, and director of the Pluralism Project. In '98, President Clinton awarded her the National Humanities Medal for the work of the Pluralism Project and the investigation of America's religious diversity. We're also joined by Professor Diane Moore, who is a senior lecturer on religious studies and education at Harvard Divinity School and senior fellow at the Center for the Study of World Religions. She's director of the Religious Literacy Project, coordinator for the Religious Studies and Education Certificate, and has served as the chair of the American Academy of Religion's Task Force on Religion in the Schools, which conducted a 3-year initiative to establish guidelines for teaching about religion in K-12 public schools. Last but certainly not least, we have Professor Mara Willard, who is a lecturer at Harvard Divinity School in Religion, Ethics, and Politics, and is the interim director of the Foundation for Religious Literacy, which seeks to foster interreligious literacy and understanding among leaders in business, education, journalism, law, and politics. Thank you, panelists, for joining us today. First, let's hear from Dr. Ibu Patel.
Thank you. So happy to be here. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. Thank you, Yusra, for organizing this. I have to say, Yusra was one of our earliest program participants in IFYC probably 10 years ago, then was on staff at our organization for 3 years, ran the President's Interfaith Challenge in partnership with the White House. I want to be clear, she is only on loan to Harvard. We expect her back in 2 years. We might have let her stay longer if she's doing a PhD, but we expect you back in Chicago soon, Yusra. Okay, so our view at Interfaith Youth Corps, our kind of worldview, is the interaction between people who orient around religion differently has great meaning and significance for everything from the identities of faith communities to the social cohesion of diverse societies to the amount of social capital in a society to peace and stability in places like Afghanistan, Syria, Egypt, etc. Right? So how people who orient around religion differently matters a great deal. And of course, we wanted to move in the direction of cooperation, or what Diana has famously put into the world, pluralism, which we kind of define as respect for people's identities, relationships between different communities, and a commitment to the common good. One of the big ideas of Interfaith Youth Corps is that people build pluralism. It doesn't magically drop from the sky. It's not likely to magically emanate from a website. It's going to be a critical mass of people who we call interfaith leaders, who act upon religious diversity in a manner that builds religious pluralism. So for this panel, what I wanted to do was kind of walk out what we think, over really the course of 10 years of doing this work, what we think is an important knowledge base of an interfaith leader, right? We're calling this interfaith literacy. I want to be clear that I think what Diane Moore and Stephen Protho and others are doing is hugely important. And one of the things I'm interested about in this panel is I'm not quite sure yet how our paradigm, so to speak, of interfaith literacy connects and overlaps with Professor Moore's project of religious literacy, Professor Protho's somewhat different project around religious literacy. I hope that that's part of the discussion. But for right now, in my opening remarks, I want to walk out the main kind of categories of what we call interfaith literacy, which is, in a very pragmatic sense, the knowledge base that we have learned is required by an interfaith leader to build bridges between people and communities who orient around religion differently. Okay, so piece of knowledge, kind of concept number one, is what we call appreciative knowledge about another religious tradition. That sounds like, frankly, a foozy word to be used in an academic setting. Let me walk it out a little bit. And let me give you this example. When there's elementary school classrooms you'll go into, which will have posters like famous women scientists, famous African-American writers, famous gay Americans, right? And I would call that the category of appreciative knowledge. It's the recognition that cultures, traditions, and communities historically underrepresented have made significant contributions that people would generally admire to the broader society. And that by learning about those things, everything from Muhammad Ali and Hakeem Olajuwon, two great American athletes, were Muslim, right? Mos Def, the great hip-hop artist, is Muslim. These are things in the category of appreciative knowledge. It's the ability to say to somebody, hey, I know something about your tradition that I admire. We have learned that that's an absolutely essential dimension of the knowledge base of an interfaith leader, is to have a sense of knowledge about other religions and other religious communities that you would admire. Okay. Category number two is the ability to identify points of contact between religious traditions. We sometimes call this shared values, but really it could also be a shared practice. It could be the fact that Muslims and Catholics both pray on beads that look somewhat similar. And because interfaith leadership is about cultivating positive relationships with people who orient around religion differently, a lot of what you're trying to do is find a starting place from which you can have a positive conversation. When I show my thusbih, my Muslim prayer beads, to a Catholic, and they immediately say, that looks like a rosary, that's the beginning of a positive conversation. The ability to identify those points of contact, I think, is hugely important. Because my friend Gabe Hakeem is in the audience, who is the Executive Vice President of Interfaith Youth Corps, I'll tell us his favorite story about points of contact here. My dad went to Notre Dame University, and he would take me to football games at Notre Dame when I was a kid growing up, and our first stop would always be the Grotto, which is the shrine to the Virgin Mary at Notre Dame, right? And so, when I was like 6 or 7 years old, my big idea was, can we just get to the football game? When I was like 10, I was like, Dad, what the hell are we doing? We're Muslim. What are we doing in front of this shrine to the Virgin Mary? And my dad didn't give me like this big roundabout theology of icons and statues in Islam. My dad pointed to the flickering candles in the grotto, and he said, the Quran says that God is light upon light. And that was it, right? He established a point of contact, frankly, a pretty surface level one, but a place to start a conversation. So that's important concept number 2 in this kind of knowledge base of an interfaith leader. I'll say one more because Yusuf just gave me the sign, which is knowing something of the history of interfaith cooperation. I think that's especially important in an era that's dominated by the clash of civilizations. And the great danger of the clash of civilizations, I think, is the aura of inevitability around religious conflict, that when Muslims and Jews get together, they can only always fight, and it's somehow inherent or endemic in their traditions and or their peoplehood. To be able to walk back through history and to say, actually, let's look at times when people who orient around religion differently have cooperated for great and urgent and compelling ends, whether that's King and Heschel and Selma, whether that's George Washington's letter to the Hebrew congregation of Newport, Rhode Island, whether it's the interfaith dimensions of the struggle in South Africa. For an interfaith leader to say people from different religions have cooperated positively in the past, there is a great tradition and story of this. We are here to write the next chapter of that story. First of all, it gives the lie to the clash of civilizations, and secondly, it gives people a sense of momentum, a sense of this grand narrative that they have the responsibility and the opportunity to kind of write the next chapter in. So those are 3 dimensions for us of the knowledge base of interfaith leadership: appreciative knowledge of other traditions, the ability to identify points of contact between them, and a sense of the history of interfaith cooperation.
Wonderful to be here today. I speak on this panel as someone who actually is an academic and who has been grounded in this work as a scholar for a long time. I would say I first started talking about religious literacy, the need to know more about the religious traditions of the world and of our neighbors 20 years ago, when we put in a major grant to the National Endowment for the Humanities with WGBH to provide what at that point was envisioned to be another public television series on world religions, but this time not one that was focused on people who were monks in the rice fields in Thailand or Sri Lanka or something like that, but one that was really focused on the United States and the fact that the religious traditions of the world are not necessarily afar off, but right across the street. So actually that series didn't really come into being, but I started working very closely with people in public television and in cities across the US at that point to talk about what the need for the knowledge of our neighbors is. And it really comes just down to that the landscape of the United States has changed so radically that we are in many places quite unaware of the fact that the religious traditions of the world are our neighbors, are the people across the street. So we did make a pilot on that series that was on Los Angeles. And for about 6 months, I would go every weekend to Los Angeles and visit Buddhist communities, which was fascinating because Los Angeles is the home of Buddhism from across Asia, really. And it totally changed my view of what different cities in the U.S. are like. I had dinner last night with a woman, Hilda Solis, who was the former Secretary of Labor, Latina, who had been a congresswoman from that district in eastern Los Angeles, and to talk to her about what it meant that Monterey Park today is 90% Asian, or that Hacienda Heights and the Shilai Temple fell in her congressional district as a Latina. I mean, these are the realities of our world that require a kind of education that we hitherto haven't really had. So the first thing I think of in religious literacy is that we need to know more about one another. Actually, that project 20 years ago, it didn't finally lead to a full series, though it did lead to that one film, Becoming the Buddha in LA, which is a great film even today. But it also led to the funding of the Pluralism Project, because I realized I needed to know more about what was happening in the US. So we, got some small grants to figure that out. And I would say that as a result of this, the way in which I think about religious literacy is not only that we need to know more about the religions of the world. That, after all, is the mission, basically, of religion departments all across the country. And that's what we do in colleges and universities. But that we need to have relationships, that our world is built on relationships, on what Ibu calls these points of contact. And the points of contact are not that distant, at least for people in the student generation. They are their roommates, their college mates, their teammates. And so neighbors of other faiths are not sort of metaphorically scattered around the world, but really in one's college environment. And that's been a very exciting thing. So as the Pluralism Project has developed, beginning with sort of general base of religious knowledge, but religious knowledge that is based on the fact that we need to know, the need to know is in relationship, as citizens, as co-citizens of a common country, a common society. And then interfaith knowledge, that's something else that I've really worked on to try to bring into the conspectus of the Academy. For a long time, interfaith was seen as sort of loosey-goosey in the Academy, and something that, you know, we were all holding hands and talking about our commonalities and this and that and the other thing. But, you know, along with Ibu, I really believe that the study of what is happening in the encounter of people and traditions and civilizations is absolutely critical. It's something that my own mentor, Wilfred Cantwell Smith, did on a cosmic level when he used to teach seminars on interfaith encounter or interreligious encounter. He didn't call it that, but times and areas of the world where you couldn't really figure out what was happening without looking at the various religious components involved. So this is, you know, to really study interfaith. If you're applying to doctoral studies today and you want to go out and apply to study interfaith works around the world, you're going to be out of luck unless you apply to Georgetown, basically, because it's all still organized by religious tradition or by themes and topics that are kind of pan-religious but don't really require that you know much about anything in particular. I mean, a peace studies program or something like that. But to take interfaith seriously as an academic subject is something that is not still happening. I mean, I gave my whole presidential address at the American Academy of Religion about that issue. And then the issue of interfaith leadership. Interfaith literacy and leadership is not simply for people who are going into interfaith affairs, although that's important. But it's important for absolutely every kind of professional person in our society. And that's why I've started working on this sort of case studies initiative to really teach into that. Whether you're going to be a superintendent of schools, whether you're going to be a public school teacher, whether you're going to be a doctor, a hospital administrator, a CEO, any aspect of our society requires people to know more about the people who are in their corporation, in their workforce, in their neighborhood than most people do. So how to raise that question in a way that is compelling. And what I've found is that the Case Studies Initiative is a way of doing that. I do it in the classroom, where we actually enter and inhabit those situations in American corporate society or in education. As a superintendent of schools in Cambridge is a protagonist in one of these. But these classes are not necessarily for people who are going to go into interfaith leadership, but simply classes in leadership for people in a multi-faith society. And all of those levels, I think both basic religious literacy, but also the ability to think about the world in which we live as one in which knowledge and connection with people of other faiths and of none is really critical. And it's critical as for people who want to study this as scholars, as people who want to participate in it, as I have in the various phases of my career, but also for people who simply want to spread these issues out as citizens. I remember studying a little interfaith blood drive in Plano, Texas a few years ago, Muslims, Christians, and Jews, and they said basically, you know, we're never going to change what happens in the Middle East, but we can make a really big difference in what happens in Plano, Texas by doing these things together. And so there it is, the beginning of a conversation I hope that will continue. Thanks.
I've been to Plano, Texas, and that's a really big deal. I worked with teachers there, and they were struggling with these questions, so that's good news. So my work has been focused primarily in education the last 15 years, but now has expanded to include other professions to look at a way to think about religion, to understand methods and strategies for what it means to help communicate about religion in a deeply illiterate world around religion. So 3 premises that have shaped my work is one, that there is this profound illiteracy about religion that spans the globe. I used to think it was located here primarily in the U.S., certainly from my own experience, but in my capacity to work with educators throughout the world, I've realized that there is actually real consistencies about some of the assumptions about religion, problematic ones, that we can trace intellectually and understand through colonialism and a whole host of things, but which is itself another study, the kind of source of illiteracy about religion, which is one of your questions. But this illiteracy, the second premise is that it has tremendous consequences. And for me, those consequences are civic in nature, that they really do hinder capacities for cooperative endeavors. They promote bigotry, they encourage prejudice, and that the ways that these assumptions get reproduced unwittingly is a major focus for me as an educator and a concern of mine as an educator. And then the third premise is that we actually can tackle this if we do it strategically, both through education in the widest variety of contexts, one certainly through schools, but not exclusively there, through these kinds of endeavors that Ibu and Diana have been involved in and help promote so importantly on the ground in local contexts, is the capacity to learn more about the other as individuals, but also the capacity to learn more about the complexities of religion on the ground. So the notion that we have lived with now for a very long time, hundreds of years, that we are just starting to challenge, I think, as a community, a global community, is this assumption that religion lives and resides in this separate and private sphere that is itself a profoundly Protestant assumption that has unfortunately shaped not just understandings of religion, but shaped international relations and public policy across the globe. And that's highly problematic, and we're, again, just starting to have people in international relations and in public policy start to realize that that assumption is highly problematic, and with now an open view to understand a more complex understanding of religion. So this is a good time. It's good news, because I think we are at a pivotal moment historically where these ideas not just are coming from people in religious studies, but are coming from people across the world in a lot of sectors. Public health understands the importance of understanding religion on the ground around what it means to understand deeply cultures around health and well-being. People in law, of course, looking at the challenges of what it means to really think about religion outside of, again, this notion of the fictional private sphere which we've placed religion in for so long. So four assumptions I'll make that have informed the method for how to think about religion, which is really my work. So the first assumption is that there's a really important distinction between the religious expression, devotional expression of an understanding of faith, and the study of religion. Now they overlap, and I don't mean to imply there's this discrete absolute categories, but we conflate those two too readily and to great problematic effect, I think. So again, the devotional expression of diverse religious traditions is what the study of religion is about. The diversity of religious expression. And the devotional expression often will promote particular theological views that an individual or a community will want to foster. And those are really important things for any healthy community, is to have people rooted in particular understandings, worldviews that they will want to promote in the wider world. So, but that distinction is an important one, and when we conflate it, we run into difficulties. The second point is that the three fundamental assumptions about religious studies, which again are self-evident in one way, but are often overlooked and not practiced. So I think it's worthwhile to name them. One is that religions are internally diverse. Not just diverse in terms of, Roman Catholicism, Protestantism, Orthodoxy, but within communities, religions are internally diverse. Within faith communities, even from a similar theological assumption. So the diversity of religion, and our teaching about religion, however, continues to promote the notion that religions are all the same and uniform. Because when we teach about religions by teaching the Four Noble Truths or the 5 Pillars or the 10 Commandments, we end up reifying this notion that there's something uniform and static about religions. Second is that religions change and evolve. And that's the other dimension. Religions are internally diverse. They evolve and change based on different social historical contexts. So religions, again, are not static and they're not uniform, yet most of the ways we learn and teach about religions promotes this notion of static and uniform assumption. And then the third is that religions are embedded in all dimensions of human experience. They always have been. They always will be. This notion, again, that the religions reside in this private place that's separate from political, economic, cultural forces is itself not only false, but it is profoundly problematic because then it assumes that religion lives in this ritual space that has nothing to do with the rest of anyone else's life or social or cultural influences. So those three assumptions of religious studies, religions are internally diverse, they evolve and change, and that the religions are embedded in all dimensions of experience, really do, again, they're all self-evident, but we don't practice them. And that's a sign itself of tremendous illiteracy about religion. So having that as a foundation serves an opportunity for us to think critically about the roles that religions play in any context. And the work I'm doing is both related still in education under the Religious Literacy Project, focusing on helping to provide opportunities for teachers to get trained in religious studies. They are expected to teach about it, but they rarely ever have training in it. It's a terribly untenable situation we put our teachers in. And we continue to do so. And then a new project I'm involved with is using the tools we've learned in education about religion to then foster better understanding of religion in other professional contexts. So we're starting a collaboration with the Tony Blair Faith Foundation here at Harvard Divinity School that'll also involve not only scholars here at Harvard and students at Harvard Divinity, but also across the university to create resources particularly focused on conflict areas across the globe to better understand, for example, the religious diversity in a place like Syria, and to not continue to reproduce the notion that that's a simple sectarian conflict between Shias and Sunnis, which of course it isn't. And so when we understand the more complex understandings of what's happening on the ground there, it gives policymakers, public health officials, others, journalists, better information about how to help think not only about a report about what's happening on the ground there, but also provides opportunities for us to think about potential solutions that may be overlooked when we have that very problematic assumption about religion.
Hi, I'm Mara Willard, and I'm going last after some very smart, experienced people, so I may be brief. But I wanted to say what a wonderful thing it is to see so many faces here and so much energy in the room around religious literacy. It's really a question that has been awakened, I think, in the last several years and even in the last several months. And I think it's important that you all think of yourselves as individuals contributing to creative solutions. This is a problem for educators and also for civil society. So those of you who are social entrepreneurs, whatever your walks of life, take yourself as empowered to make changes. So I teach religion and American public life right now at the Divinity School, and the way we've organized the class is to look at the history of religion in American institutions, then at some of the constitutional laws and the rise of liberal secularism. And the last third of the class is looking at practitioners and people who are active in religion and public life. So we've been lucky enough to have Ibu Patel come talk to us. We'll also later in the semester be hosting Sean Casey, who is working at the State Department. You're all welcome to come be part of that conversation too. And Representative Marjorie Decker is going to come talk about her experience in the city of Cambridge working with religion. Because there are all such different ways that professions interact with religious constituencies, as we've talked about today. So my background in religion and political theory makes me inclined to talk just for a few minutes about the ways that liberal political theory has informed our habits today. This is something that Diane alluded to. So John Locke had to flee to the Netherlands, had to run away from the English Civil Wars, and when he came back, he proposed this radical idea of tolerance of other Protestant divisions, as long as you weren't a crazy Quaker or like too Catholic in your Anglicanism. Let's just try to get along here, folks. So he said, you know, when you're going to be the magistrate, take off your religious believing hat and don't persecute others based on your beliefs. You can't know what the true religion is. And Locke had such a profound influence. He helped write this Constitution of South Carolina. He helped the ideas of the American Constitution. And that's part of why we, as Americans, through these contingencies of history, have this idea that religion has to be narrowly confined and kept under control, that we have to keep it in the private sphere. So over the course of American history, there certainly was religion in public life. There's always been religious social forces for abolition, for temperance, for all kinds of social justice issues, the civil rights movement. But in the middle of the 20th century, there became more respect for the ways that the Protestant majority and the ways that practiced Christianity had a price that was paid by religious minorities. So looking across at Europe and the persecution and genocide of European Jewry, Americans became more self-consciously interested in being religiously pluralist. So this took some forms of, let's just call ourselves Judeo-Christian, problem solved. And otherwise, the Supreme Court got more serious about cracking down on those who are violating the Establishment Clause. So by the 1950s and 1960s, you had restrictions on the ways that religion was taught in schools. No more Bible reading in schools as a kind of pietistic practice. No more prayers in public schools that favored Protestant Christianity over others. And at the same time, you had this rising interest in a study of religion coming out of Germany, of religion as Wissenschaft. Anne Monius made me do all this reading about 6 years ago, and I guess I'm grateful after all. Turned out it was relevant, right? So there was this possibility of looking at religion from a different angle by the middle of the 20th century, of having a social scientific view of religion. But the problem, as Professor Moore alluded to, was that teachers never had any training in religion as Wissenschaft. They knew how to teach a Bible class or talk about allegories of Eve and Adam in the Garden of Evil. But who is going to teach this new kind of approach to religion is a problem that remains unsolved. So even though in the Schempp case, the Supreme Court says, please teach religion, make us intelligent about religion, help us understand religious diversity, we don't have any kind of workforce to fill that space. And I think it's interesting that civil society has responded so powerfully, that it's not necessarily been a project that government knows how to fix or that private academies know how to fix, although there's been some great work with the Pluralism Project and elsewhere in America at Chico. But it's a place where a lot of young people have taken it upon themselves to create spaces for learning more about religions and about how to talk across religions. And I think it's a great promise for America that we have these millennials who see we don't want to live in this 9/11 world of religion is scary and bad, and Sam Huntington's going to write the script. We want to write a different kind of script. So I really applaud the work that's being done by Abu, by Ben Marcus, by Usra. I think that the Center on the Study of World Religion is fostering a lot of this stuff. And I hope that we can include more funders and more conversation partners as this all gets going. Thanks.
Everyone, let's have a round of applause for our panelists. As you formulate your burning questions, I will pose one to the panelists. Specifically, I'm interested in your thoughts about the sources of religious literacy. Professor Moore, you alluded to this. And also, how do we, as members of the Harvard community, combat it?
Thanks.
How do we combat religious illiteracy?
Oh.
I've been struck today, as I've had the pleasure of being around campus with Ibu. We were at Memorial Church and then my class. There's a lot of student anxiety about this question of religious illiteracy. I think people feel almost more comfortable with interfaith work right now than they do about knowing their own traditions. So Ibu's got these fabulous ways of helping us think about points of contact and building service projects. And people, at least at Harvard, feel like I need to be a little more credentialed in my own background before I can go into it. Or what do we do about the nuns? Which to me suggests there are a lot of nuns who don't know if they're really invited to the party or not. So I'm just going to add that, the question of young people in their 20s not being sure of their own traditions and where do they go for resources.
I think the question of the origin of it is a little more complicated than is worth going into right now. But I do think that the source of how to combat it is very much a university and educational endeavor, and that it isn't just about offering more religion or religious studies courses, because I think ultimately, because religion is embedded in all aspects of human experience, what we need is better. In fact, I often make this connection. It's like we used to teach American history, and then we'd have a unit at the last week of American history called women in American history. That's not so long ago. As though, of course, women just weren't there for the other 90% of the time, and now we're going to deal with where they are. So religion's like that. Religion is everywhere. So I do think obviously the opportunity to train educators in the methods of religious studies is critical, but that's not then to say we want religious studies courses in schools. I don't think we want that. And the American Academy of Religion guidelines that we created actually don't promote that. Because what we need are people in English language arts, in history, to better understand the roles that religions play. And I think that's the issue here across the university as well, to have better collaborations among faculties and students across the different professional schools and within the college, to be able to think about and have better understanding of the embeddedness of religion with a method and an understanding of how we can really see religion everywhere and not just have it tacked on in the end of courses or in our private lives.
As someone who lives with 400 Harvard undergraduates, I actually don't think that people are very anxious about religion, except perhaps Christians. I mean, this is maybe the most anxious group. The Hindu student group at Harvard is energetic. They meet on their own. They have their own arities and discussions every Friday. They have their own leadership, actually. They don't, there is some sort of assigned a chaplain, Swami Tyagananda or something. They don't bother with that. They really are their own energy, and they are in every field of study, but consciously about the business of trying to deepen their own faith and expand it. I mean, they had a mock Hindu wedding. They've had one every year, but last year it was a mock Hindu same-sex wedding that was really very interesting and that involved these students in, a kind of groundbreaking endeavor in their own tradition. The same with the Harvard Islamic Society, which is having its own very major banquet and event this weekend on the occasion of Ashura. And these are people who are very comfortable and expanding their area of comfort in their own faith, but also who live in a context with roommates who are of other faiths. So the issues, I think, are primarily finding ways in which people who are a little bit older can feel comfortable with the energies and dynamism of younger faith practitioners. And it doesn't really follow I mean, some of it is within the bounds of what we call religious traditions, but others are simply the incredible amount of multi-faith work that takes place in service projects and in model UN projects and things that people plunge their energies into in ways that I find absolutely astonishing. That Harvard students and other students can join together to create Model United Nations projects across the world, perhaps improving the model that the United Nations itself uses. So I don't know. I think there's a lot there that we don't understand about the energies of students today. So.
We have a question. Come on up.
Hi, thanks for your talk. The very fact that different religions are coming together under this roof and we are studying all different religions, probably we are meeting, and there are two terms which I'm working on. One is religion and another is spirituality. There's goodness in different religions, and when all the goodness come together, there's commonality in the goodness, and when we bring together, does it take me towards a step towards defining the term spirituality?
I have nothing smart to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, I would say only, Krish, that for many people the term spirituality has come to mean just what you said, the goodness in religion, the things that are that are vibrant and deep and wonderful, when in fact the idea of belonging to a religion and going to certain places at certain times, or whatever traditional ways in which they thought religiousness was expressed, is deader than a doornail in their lives. So I think that really is, it's, it's sensing that there's something really good there, but they are not interested in what they so often referred to as institutional religion.
It's interesting because I think the other reason that this is not based on anything except my association that I just made 30 seconds ago. So forgive me if it's not that profound, but there is a rise in spirituality, as we know in the U.S., and among younger people, a decline in religious affiliation. My sense about that is related to what I also wish we were better at teaching, which is that religions are complicated things, and they promote they promote the full range of human expression, right? And they give license to the full range of human expression, from the awful, the heinous, to the wonderful, heroic, aspirational. And that when we have the discourses which are very common, when we say, well, we'll hear the assertion Islam or Christianity are religions of terror, and then you hear no, Islam and Christianity are religions of peace. Well, the fact is they're both, and the language of recognizing both, I think, is a really important part of literacy about religion. Is how do we discern the roles that religion play across that spectrum? And so the rise of the notion of spirituality, then, I think, is often amidst the human yearning for meaning that people feel like they can't find in religions, because there is a very strong sense that religions are hypocritical. Now, I wish there was more depth to that understanding, but I think that's true, and I do think it speaks to that desire for senses of worldviews and aspirational sense of belonging that spirituality for many represents. So for me, that's the nature of why we have a rise in spirituality and maybe a decline in religious affiliation as one potential way to understand that.
Thank you. We've got another question.
Are we on topic so far? Yes. Okay. Just want you to keep an eye on that.
I'll stand up. I have a question about interfaith that is mostly directed maybe to Ibu, but to all panelists. I have some experience working with teenagers around interfaith issues, and in my experience, although it's incredibly powerful to bring people together on points of contact, I also wonder about what happens when there aren't points of contact. What do we do with that? And does that just mean that interfaith is over, or is the conversation over? And I wonder, like, how can we generate productive discussions and education models that also allow for difficult conversations, tensions, disagreements, and real challenges, because we aren't always going to be able to just hold hands like that. So yeah, that's kind of my question.
So I think that's a profound question which gets to the heart of the interfaith enterprise, so to speak. So let me just state again, for me, what the term interfaith denotes is when people from who orient around religion differently interact, it now has huge significance for a range of things, right? So it's the interaction between people who orient around religion differently, that's kind of our laser focus at IFYC, which is to say there's many things about religious diversity that don't necessarily mean the intense interaction in the public square. That's what we're talking about when we say the word interfaith. So there's a couple of ways that I want to address your question. One is, it's too easy to say that the job of an interfaith leader is to identify common ground. The reason that that's too easy to say is because the term common ground somehow is connected in people's minds to the idea of holding hands, and then people giggle, and people think that it's not compelling, right? I think a huge part of an interfaith leader is to identify points of contact and make them compelling, make them inspiring. right? That it feels to me that when Muslims and Catholics can come together and talk about the role of light in their traditions, there is a way that an interfaith leader makes that inspiring and urgent, and that is perhaps a more important conversation to have than the 1,000 ways that Muslims and Catholics are going to disagree, right? This is not to say that the conversation around disagreement isn't important. It is only to say that our suggestion at Interfaith Youth Corps is to begin with the point of contact. The point of contact does not mean sameness. The point of contact means the beginning of a conversation about particularities that is productive and constructive. Like, for example, the role of light in Islam and Catholicism, right? Is there a way of making that urgent, compelling, fun, exciting, inspiring, and therefore the beginnings of a productive conversation? After that, it feels to me that you are much more ready to engage conversations about disagreement. The reason I want to use the word disagreement is because very frequently in settings in which people come together to talk about religious diversity and interfaith cooperation, the term difference is used as if it is, on the face of it, a good thing. And then somebody will stand up and say, but people who don't agree with gay marriage, I never want to talk to them. And I'm like, well, welcome to difference, right? Like 50% of America doesn't agree with you on that. Welcome to difference, right? 50% of America doesn't agree with you on the abortion question. So the reason I want to focus on that is to say, when we're talking about the ways in which people orient around religion differently, we're talking about some of the most fundamental disagreements on the face of the earth. And I don't think we should approach those without a very strong sense of relationship first, which is what I think establishing the compellingness and urgency and inspiration of points of contact allows. So, quick, obvious example. Muslims and Jews, I don't think, should start a conversation about the Israeli-Palestinian issue, right? The reason is because there is a great danger to seeing the other community entirely through that prism. It feels to me like a far better way of going about it is to establish positive, inspiring, constructive, compelling points of contact between Muslims and Jews, such that they have a sense of each other's community and tradition that feels like there is something sacred to that relationship, and then to approach a profound disagreement like views of the Middle East.
Ooh, we have so many hands. Let's hear.
Diana.
No, that's okay.
Okay.
Go on.
You know what we're going to do? We're going to do rapid fire. I'm going to hand a couple of you the microphone, pose your questions, and then in the last few minutes, panelists will answer any of the questions they feel they can. Go ahead.
So this is probably an overly simple question, but I'm wondering how each of you would, or whoever would like to take it, would define religious literacy. And I ask that because I could have answered all those questions you mentioned in the beginning. I don't necessarily think I'm all that religiously literate. How do you know? I'm raising 3 kids without religion, but I want them to be religiously literate. How do I know if I'm doing my job?
Okay, and we'll hear from Ben.
Hi. So I was working at the State Department this summer, and one of the things that they talk about is one of their objectives is to counter violent extremism. And so it's one of the priorities of the U.S. government, not necessarily to change what people think about religion, just to make them less violent. And so I guess my question ties into, is religious literacy always agenda-based, and is the agenda always about promoting pluralism, or can we just have a threshold which is stop having people kill each other? That's the basic.
Thank you, Ben. And I saw a couple hands here. Would you please pass this down? Thanks.
Hi. We've talked a lot about inculcating religious literacy in young people, and I wonder what steps we, lowercase w, and we, society, can take to work on helping to make our adult populations more religiously literate.
Hi. I'm obviously, well, not obviously, but I am studying religion now here at HDS, and I've done a lot of interfaith work in the past in my undergrad experience, and I just came from the noon service upstairs, and my sense is that it's in the noon service and in the extracurricular encounters where we get a much more authentic encounter with our neighbors' religious practices, with the more consuming religious identity pieces of who they are and what they do. So if we're talking about religious literacy at the university level, I guess I'd want to know, how are we gonna, or how are you going to, and I'm going to, institutionalize that kind of education, the more experiential ed that I think is like far more important than most of the work that I currently do, though interesting. I don't know that it's actually as important.
Great, thank you everyone, and panelists, you're on your own.
Right.
Okay.
Should we just go?
Yeah.
Left, right?
So the parent question I think is really interesting, and I have 2 little kids, and I think about this because you get the existential questions from kids before they have the scope of being able to hold difference in their heads or being able to do religion as Wissenschaft. So I think that that's another market that needs to be served, of how to help parents talk to their kids about different perspectives and how to respect different religions, but also to be allowed to have a particular commitment. If you don't have a particular commitment in your family, then you do have a different challenge of how you answer those existential questions. And then, Ben, I think it's also a terrific question about, is religious literacy always agenda-based? Is the agenda just to have a better educated person in the humanities and social sciences, or is there a normative agenda there about changing society? And I'd love to hear you think more about it at some point. But I guess as a citizen, I think it's worth being for the moderation of extremism. But I think that there's a real danger of this project being driven by the threat of violence, so that the conversation is we have to stem the Huntington threat instead of, there are lots of reasons to know about religion's beauty and power and ugliness and complications and why and how it changes and relates to money. And that if we make extremism the conversation partner, we narrow that.
I agree with that very much. Just to answer quickly the question, we do have definitions around religious literacy and illiteracy, the ones that we've adopted for the AAR guidelines. And basically, in a nutshell, it's saying it's actually not about the 10 Commandments, Four Noble Truths. It's really about a method. It's a way to think about religion. So we're trying to actually challenge this notion of literacy being content-driven and being more methodologically driven. So how do you think about religion? And then those 3 points I made would be relevant to that. I think the issue of the agenda-driven question is that all of us have agendas. All of us, all the time, have agendas. So the notion that there's neutrality in religion or neutrality in education about religion is itself a fiction. So the question for me is always about then being able to own your agenda. Just like I started out talking about the premises that bring me to this work, I think there are incredible consequences to illiteracy about religion that also don't include the civic consequences. But my own work is really driven by that, and both the ways that we lose opportunities for cooperative endeavors when we don't understand each other, and the ways that we promote those conflicts that I think we could minimize. So I think that issue of owning one's agenda explicitly, what are you trying to promote in any given endeavor, educationally or formally or informally, is really an important dimension of this. And that will help itself give us deeper ways to communicate about our aspirations around what it means to promote literacy about religion and what we even mean by literacy.
The origins of the Pluralism Project were explicitly to do something quite different from what the Fundamentalism Project at Chicago did in the 1980s, which is basically to study the roots of violent fundamentalism. And if you look at the media imprint of this is really, really important, and it's important to be sophisticated about how it is. Of course, anything that is violent and terrorist-driven is precisely in order to make a media imprint. And what we didn't know is where are the places where people all over the world, and this was true in the 90s, it became even more true in the last 15 years, where people all over the world are engaged in projects together. So the Pluralism Project was really to build from the ground up a way of looking at what's happening in the religious world that is not driven by the flare-up of violence, but driven by relationship and cooperation, because there was a lot of it happening. And I think that's one place where we need to be careful about how we think about things. The other is your question about getting involved in thinking through an interfaith encounter that is not necessarily one of cooperation or fun and fellowship, but really the serious issues of our society. And that's what I try to do in the course I teach spring term, which is that we have 15 major scenarios that you have to enter into. They're not yours. They might be, Daisy Kahn's long-standing interest in developing an interfaith center that involves women and others in Lower Manhattan, combined with Imam Faisal Rauf, her husband, to create the Cordoba Project. And then getting that approved by the Lower Manhattan Community Board, going out to a festive dinner and saying, wow, this is so great that they support what we're doing, and waking up the next morning to the New York Daily News having a headline, 13-story mosque approved at Ground Zero. Now, something's going on there that is not about the interfaith movement and not, something simple about civic affairs, but something that requires our entering into that scenario and becoming part of it and finding out what happened. What is it that happened? And, in terms of media imprint, the very largest media imprint these days is in a very well-orchestrated Islamophobic series of groups in the United States and elsewhere that are well-funded and have a very good media strategy. And if you look, as one could do, at the media imprint of all of the things that we do together and all the other interfaith groups in the world, it's almost zero compared to the rest of it. So we have an issue that is larger than simply what this group or that group is doing. And it requires strategic thinking on the part of people who are concerned about the issues that we are, because there are enormous and well-funded people who are interested in very different things than we're interested in this room.
So two quick takes. One is to Ben's question, which I'll just nuance a little bit and say, another way of asking a question is what's at stake, right? And what's at stake for the State Department, it makes good sense to me from their perspective, is how do we prevent or stem, as Mara said, violent extremism? I think that is one dimension of positive engagement of religious diversity and interfaith issues is to prevent or reduce the likelihood of violence. I think it is a good thing to do that, right? But I think that we're not just preventing the bad. I think that we are also enriching the good. I think that notions of beauty and learning and enrichment are important in this, but I also think that there's a couple of other things which you could take to the Ford Foundation or to a government actor and they would understand. So one is the cohesiveness of different groups and the identities and dignity of different groups. There's a religious freedom issue at stake when Pam Geller with the Victory Mosque at Ground Zero line can effectively prevent or at least delay the building of a mosque. The second thing is social cohesion, right? So in highly diverse societies, how people who orient around religion differently get along matters a great deal. So social cohesion is, when it works well, it is a significant good. When it doesn't work well, it's a danger territory. And the final thing is social capital. And Bob Putnam here at Harvard famously wrote in the 1990s that religious communities are the largest repositories of social capital in the United States. The ability to bridge that social capital, which is to say, if you're a skilled interfaith leader and you're able to bring, as Orr has been at Hebrew College and Andover Newton, groups together around healthcare in Massachusetts, that's a significant kind of unalloyed good for a society, especially a society that relies on its civic sphere as much as America does. So the second thing I want to say is per your comment on universities and interfaith cooperation, and I just wanted to do an and to what you're saying. So I think what Yusra and her colleagues did around making you all take the Shahada at noon in Harvard Divinity School. That's a joke, by the way. Is that on tape? I'm going to get into big trouble about that. But the co-curricular, or if you will, the civil society dimension of a college campus is amazing, right? It's amazing that campuses, in addition to classrooms, effectively serve as a micro-civil society. But I think that, and a big part of what Interfaith Youth Corps is working on is the idea that there ought to be academic practitioner programs in interfaith leadership at universities around the country and the world. So it feels to me like you ought to be able to go to Boston College, major in religion, and get a concentration in interfaith leadership, right? And that concentration might be a 5-course sequence, but there are political theory perspectives from Locke to Walzer on difference in a society. There's a significant sociological dimension to this, right? The work that Putnam and Wuthnow and David Campbell and many others have done around religious diversity in America. There's social psychological dimensions to this. In what micro situations do people from different religious groups tend to get along, and in what situations do they tend to fight? Clearly there are religious studies and theological dimensions to this. There could be classes like theologies of interfaith cooperation or theologies of justice across religions, right? So, you know, a big part of what we're working on at IFYC is helping colleges develop course sequences in interfaith leadership or interfaith cooperation. We want colleges to develop both what we call a horizontal, which is to say a sense that everybody on that campus would get some kind of robust touch with interfaith issues. You'd have a module in a course. You'd have a case study that Diana would develop in her course here that would be taught at Cabrini College down in Philadelphia where I was yesterday. Everybody gets a touch. It's similar to how campuses viewed multiculturalism, a non-Western civ requirement.
Sorry to cut you off.
Yeah. Last sentence.
Okay.
In addition to the horizontal, there would be a vertical, and that would be your course sequence. Everybody would get a touch. People who wanted to specialize would walk up that vertical into a sense of expertise.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's hear another round of applause for the panelists.